When Elvis was singing on stage and 9-year-old Sophie shouted, "You're singing it wrong," the hall went dead silent. But Elvis's display of greatness in that moment would move Sophie to tears of joy and create an unforgettable moment. Sophie Williams was a remarkable 9-year-old girl with an extraordinary gift for musical accuracy and an almost supernatural ability to detect even the smallest imperfections in vocal performances. Living in the music-rich city of Nashville, Tennessee, she had been surrounded by melodies, harmonies, and rhythms since she could barely walk. Her modest home, which she shared with her grandmother Rose and her younger brother Danny, was filled with the constant sound of music from the old radio that sat prominently on their kitchen counter, playing everything from classic country to rock and roll throughout the day. What made Sophie truly exceptional wasn't just her love for music, but her remarkable ear for musical detail that seemed to operate on a level far beyond her years. She possessed what musicians call perfect pitch, the rare ability to identify or produce any musical note without a reference point. But Sophie's gift went even deeper than that. She could detect subtle variations in tempo, catch missed lyrics, and instantly recognize when a singer was performing a song differently from its original recording, even if the changes were barely noticeable to most listeners. Sophie's fascination with musical precision had begun when she was barely 6 years old, after her grandmother had played her a collection of Elvis Presley records that had belonged to Sophie's late grandfather. From the moment she heard Elvis's voice flowing through their old speakers, Sophie became completely captivated not just by the emotional power of his performances, but by the technical perfection he brought to every song. She would listen to each track over and over again, memorizing not just the lyrics, but every vocal inflection, every subtle pause, and every harmonic detail. The young girl had an almost photographic memory for music, and she could recall with perfect accuracy how Elvis sang every single one of his songs. She knew which takes were used for the final recordings, which versions featured different instrumental arrangements, and even which performances included slight variations in lyrics or melody. Her knowledge of Elvis's catalog was encyclopedic and deeply personal. She didn't just know the songs, she understood them on a level that would have impressed professional musicologists. Sophie's grandmother Rose, a kind woman with silver hair and tired eyes who had worked as a seamstress for most of her life, recognized her granddaughter's exceptional abilities, but sometimes worried about Sophie's tendency to correct other people's musical mistakes. At school concerts, Sophie would involuntarily point out when the pianist played wrong chords or when singers forgot lyrics. During church services, she would quietly hum the correct melody when the choir sang off-key. Her corrections always came from a place of genuine love for music, rather than any desire to embarrass others. But Rose often had to remind Sophie about the importance of tact and kindness when sharing her musical observations. Despite her sometimes challenging perfectionism, Sophie was beloved by those who knew her well. Her musical insights were often brilliant, and her passion for getting things right came from a pure place of devotion to the art form, rather than any superiority complex. Her teachers appreciated her knowledge, even when they had to gently redirect her corrective impulses, and her few close friends had learned to value her musical guidance, knowing that Sophie's suggestions always made their own performances better. Sophie's bedroom was decorated with posters of various musicians, but the centerpiece was a large, framed photograph of Elvis Presley that hung directly above her small desk where she did her homework each evening. The image showed Elvis in one of his iconic white jumpsuits, captured mid-performance with his arms outstretched and his face glowing with the joy of entertaining an audience. To Sophie, this photograph represented everything she loved about music, the combination of technical excellence and emotional authenticity that made Elvis's performances so magical. The opportunity that would bring Sophie face to face with her musical hero came when Elvis announced a special benefit concert at the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville. The concert was was designed to raise money for local children's charities, and tickets were priced to be affordable for families throughout the community. When Rose heard about the concert, she knew immediately that she had to find a way to take Sophie, even though money was always tight in their household. Rose worked extra hours at the textile factory where she had been employed for nearly 20 years, saving every spare dollar for weeks leading up to the concert. She wanted to give Sophie this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see Elvis perform live, knowing how much it would mean to her musically gifted granddaughter. When Rose finally managed to purchase 2 tickets for seats in the middle section of the historic venue, Sophie's excitement was so intense that she could barely eat or sleep in the days leading up to the show. On the evening of the concert, the Ryman Auditorium was electric with anticipation and filled to capacity with fans who had come from across the region to see the King of Rock and Roll perform in Nashville's most legendary venue. Sophie and Rose arrived early and found their seats about 15 rows back from the stage, close enough to see Elvis's facial expressions, but far enough back to be surrounded by hundreds of other devoted fans. Sophie had prepared for this evening with the thoroughness of a music scholar attending an important lecture. She had reviewed Elvis's entire catalog, refreshing her memory of every song he might potentially perform. She carried with her a small notebook where she had written down the correct lyrics to all of his most popular songs, not because she planned to use it during the concert, but because having it with her made her feel more prepared to fully appreciate whatever musical magic was about to unfold on stage. When Elvis finally appeared, walking onto the Ryman stage wearing a simple black shirt and pants instead of one of his elaborate jumpsuits, the audience erupted into thunderous applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the historic building. Sophie clapped until her hands were sore, her young face glowing with pure joy and anticipation as she watched her hero settle in with his guitar for what promised to be an intimate acoustic performance. The concert began beautifully, with Elvis performing several of his most beloved songs with the stripped-down arrangements that showcased his vocal abilities without the elaborate production that characterized his larger shows. Sophie listened with rapt attention, marveling at how Elvis's voice sounded even more powerful and nuanced in person than it did on the recording she knew so well. Every note was exactly as it should be, every lyric delivered with perfect timing and emotion. For the first half of the concert, Elvis's performance was flawless, and Sophie was in absolute heaven. This was everything she had hoped for, a chance to hear her musical hero perform with crystal clear precision in one of music's most revered venues. She found herself studying not just Elvis's vocal technique, but his stage presence, his interaction with the audience, and the way he seemed to inhabit each song completely. But then, about 2/3 of the way through the concert, something happened that would create one of the most memorable moments in both Elvis's career and Sophie's young life. As Elvis began performing Love Me Tender, one of his most famous and frequently performed songs, Sophie immediately noticed something that made her heart skip a beat with concern. Elvis was singing the wrong lyrics to the second verse. It was a subtle mistake that most people in the audience wouldn't catch, but to Sophie's perfectly trained ear, it was as obvious as if Elvis had suddenly started singing in a different language. He was mixing lyrics from the second verse with words from the bridge, creating a version that didn't match the familiar song structure that millions of fans knew and loved. Sophie could see that Elvis seemed slightly unsure of himself as he sang, probably realizing that something wasn't quite right, but unable to correct course mid-performance. Sophie's first instinct was to assume that Elvis was intentionally trying a different arrangement, perhaps experimenting with the song for artistic reasons. But as he continued singing, she could see the slight confusion in his expression, the way his eyes seemed to be searching for the right words, and the barely perceptible hesitation in his delivery. It became clear to Sophie that this wasn't an intentional creative choice. Elvis had simply gotten mixed up in the lyrics, probably due to the pressure of performing, or perhaps because the stage lighting was making it difficult for him to see his set list clearly. For most 9-year-olds, this would have been a minor detail that they might not even notice, and certainly not something they would feel compelled to address publicly. But Sophie wasn't most 9-year-olds. Her deep love for musical accuracy and her unwavering commitment to honoring the songs she cherished made it genuinely painful for her to sit there and listen to one of Elvis's most beautiful songs being performed incorrectly. Sophie looked around at the other audience members, hoping to see some recognition of the mistake on their faces, but everyone seemed to be enjoying the performance without noticing the lyrical error. Even her grandmother Rose, who knew Elvis's music fairly well, was swaying along contentedly, clearly not detecting the problem that was causing Sophie such distress. But Sophie's musical integrity wouldn't allow her to simply sit there and let this continue. She loved Elvis too much to watch him struggle through a song that wasn't working properly, and she respected the music too much to let one of its most beautiful examples be performed incorrectly without trying to help. In her young mind, the solution was simple and obvious. Someone needed to let Elvis know about the mistake so he could fix it and deliver the beautiful performance that both he and the song deserved. Without fully considering the social implications of her actions, without thinking about the hundreds of people in the audience or the potential embarrassment she might cause, Sophie did what her musical instincts and her love for Elvis told her was the right thing to do. She stood up from her seat, cupped her small hands around her mouth to project her voice, and called out in a clear, carrying voice that cut through the gentle melody, "You're singing it wrong!" The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Elvis's voice faltered and then stopped completely as the words registered, his guitar falling silent as his fingers froze on the strings. The entire Ryman Auditorium fell into a stunned silence so complete that you could have heard a pin drop from the balcony to the front row. Every single person in the venue, from longtime Elvis fans to curious first-time attendees, turned to look in the direction of the voice that had dared to interrupt the king of rock and roll. Sophie's grandmother Rose felt her heart stop as she realized that her 9-year-old granddaughter had just corrected Elvis Presley in front of nearly 3,000 people. Rose reached out instinctively to pull Sophie back down into her seat, her face flushing with a mixture of mortification and protective concern. Around them, other audience members were turning to stare, some with expressions of shock, others with curiosity, and a few with what looked like disapproval at the child who had disrupted the concert. On stage, Elvis stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, his eyes scanning the audience as he tried to locate the source of the correction. Sophie, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what she had done, and feeling the weight of thousands of pairs of eyes upon her, felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. But even in her moment of panic, her musical convictions remained strong. She knew she was right about the lyrics, and she genuinely believed that Elvis would want to know about the mistake. As Elvis's gaze finally found Sophie, a small girl standing among the seated adults, her face red with embarrassment but her posture still defiant, something remarkable happened on his face. Instead of showing anger or irritation at being interrupted and corrected in front of his audience, Elvis's expression slowly transformed into one of genuine curiosity and, surprisingly, what looked like admiration. "Well now," Elvis said into the microphone, his voice carrying that familiar warmth and charm that had endeared him to millions of fans, "it sounds like we have a young music expert in the audience tonight." The tension in the room began to ease slightly as people heard the kindness in Elvis's tone, but everyone was still holding their breath to see how this unprecedented situation would unfold. Elvis set his guitar on its stand and stepped closer to the edge of the stage, shielding his eyes with his hand as he tried to get a better look at Sophie. "Sweetheart, did you just tell me I was singing my own song wrong?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. There was no anger in his tone, only genuine curiosity and perhaps a hint of amusement. Sophie, despite her embarrassment, found her voice and called back, "Yes, sir. In the second verse, you sang, 'Love me tender, love me sweet,' but then you mixed in the words from the bridge. The second verse should be, 'Love me tender, love me long, take me to your heart so strong.'" Her voice was clear and confident, demonstrating not just that she had caught the mistake, but that she knew the correct lyrics from memory. A murmur of recognition went through the audience as people began to understand what had happened. This wasn't just a random interruption from a restless child. This was a musically knowledgeable young fan who had identified a genuine mistake and had been brave enough to speak up about it. Some audience members began to nod as they recalled the correct lyrics themselves, realizing that the little girl was absolutely right. Elvis paused for a moment, then picked up his guitar and played through the verse again, this time with the correct lyrics that Sophie had provided. As he sang the proper words, a smile spread across his face, and he looked directly at Sophie with unmistakable admiration. "You know what, sweetheart? You're absolutely right. Thank you for keeping me honest." The audience began to applaud, not just for Elvis's gracious response, but for Sophie's musical knowledge and courage. But Elvis wasn't finished. He looked out at the crowd and spoke with genuine emotion in his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this young lady just reminded me of something very important. Music belongs to all of us who love it, and sometimes it takes someone with a pure heart and a good ear to help us remember how to do it right." He turned his attention back to Sophie, his expression warm and encouraging. "What's your name, honey?" "Sophie Williams," she replied, her confidence growing as she realized that Elvis wasn't angry with her, but was actually grateful for her correction. "Well, Sophie Williams," Elvis said, "I want everyone here to know that you've got something very special. It takes real love for music to catch a mistake like that, and it takes real courage to speak up about it, even when it might be scary." He paused, looking out at the entire audience. "This young lady just taught me something tonight. She reminded me that the music is bigger than any one person, even bigger than Elvis Presley. When someone loves music enough to help us get it right, we should listen and say thank you." The applause grew louder and more sustained, but what happened next would be etched in Sophie's memory forever. Elvis looked directly at her and said, "Sophie, your love for music and your courage to speak up just made this old singer very happy. In fact, I think I might be getting a little emotional here." And indeed, as Sophie looked up at Elvis on the stage, she could see that his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. But these weren't tears of embarrassment or frustration. They were clearly tears of joy and gratitude. Elvis was genuinely moved by Sophie's pure love for musical accuracy and her brave willingness to help him deliver the best performance possible. When Sophie saw those tears of happiness in Elvis's eyes, when she realized that her correction had been received not as criticism, but as a gift of love from one music lover to another, her own emotions overwhelmed her completely. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, but like Elvis's tears, these were tears of pure joy. She was crying because Elvis had shown her such kindness, because her love of music had been validated by her hero, and because she had somehow been able to help make the performance better. "Now I think I'm going to cry too," Elvis said with a gentle laugh, wiping his own eyes. "Sophie, you've reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place, because it brings people together and makes us all better when we care enough to help each other get it right." Elvis then did something that surprised everyone in the audience, including Sophie herself. "Sophie, I wonder if you'd do me the honor of helping me sing this song the right way. Would you come up here and make sure I get all the words correct this time?" The audience erupted in encouraging applause and cheers as Sophie looked at her grandmother for permission. Rose, with tears of pride streaming down her own face, nodded enthusiastically and helped guide Sophie toward the aisle. As the 9-year-old girl made her way through the rows of seats, receiving smiles, pats on the back, and words of encouragement from other audience members, she felt as though she was walking into the most wonderful dream imaginable. Elvis helped Sophie up onto the historic Ryman stage and positioned her next to his microphone stand, making sure she was comfortable and could be heard clearly by everyone in the venue. "Now, Sophie," he said, "I want you to help me sing 'Love Me Tender' the right way. If I get any words wrong, you just let me know, okay?" Sophie nodded eagerly, wiping the happy tears from her cheeks as she stood next to her musical hero on one of the most famous stages in American music. As Elvis began the song again, this time with the correct lyrics, chorus. Sophie quietly sang along, her pure, sweet voice blending beautifully with Elvis's rich tones. This time, the performance was flawless. Elvis sang every word correctly, his voice carrying all the emotion and tenderness that made the song so beloved. But what made the moment truly magical was the sight of the world's most famous entertainer sharing his stage with a 9-year-old girl whose love for music had moved him to tears of joy. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous and sustained, lasting for several minutes as the audience celebrated not just the beautiful performance, but the extraordinary display of grace, humility, and mutual respect they had witnessed. Parents pointed out the scene to their children as an example of how to handle criticism with dignity, while music lovers of all ages were moved by the pure connection between artist and fan that had just played out before them. Elvis knelt down to Sophie's level and spoke to her quietly, though his words were still picked up by the microphone. "Sophie, you have a gift that's very rare. You don't just love music, you understand it and you want to protect it. Don't ever lose that honesty about music, even when it might be hard to speak up. Music needs people like you." As Sophie returned to her seat amid continued applause and congratulations, the rest of the concert took on an even more special quality. Elvis seemed energized and inspired by the interaction, and his remaining performances were some of the most heartfelt and technically perfect of his career. He frequently glanced over at Sophie during songs, sometimes with a smile and a nod when he executed a particularly challenging passage correctly. After the concert ended, Elvis made sure that Sophie and her grandmother were invited backstage for a personal meeting. Away from the stage lights and the audience, Elvis spent nearly an hour talking with Sophie about music, asking her about her favorite songs, her musical training, and her dreams for the future. He was genuinely interested in her musical insights and seemed delighted by her encyclopedic knowledge of his catalog. Before they left, Elvis gave Sophie a gift that would become one of her most treasured possessions, a signed photograph of himself with a personal message that read, "To Sophie, thank you for helping me remember that music is about getting it right and sharing it with love. Keep listening with your heart and your ears. Your friend, Elvis." But even more meaningful than the photograph was the lesson Sophie learned that evening about grace, humility, and the importance of handling criticism with kindness. Elvis had shown her that truly great artists don't just accept correction. They welcome it, learn from it, and use it to become better. His tears of joy had taught her that music was indeed bigger than any one person, and that sharing knowledge and love for music was one of the most beautiful things people could do for each other. The story of Sophie's correction and Elvis's gracious response became legendary in Nashville music circles and beyond. It was frequently cited as an example of how true musical greatness includes the humility to accept input from anyone who genuinely loves music, regardless of their age or status. Music teachers began using the story to illustrate the importance of both accuracy and kindness in musical education. For Sophie, the experience shaped not only her musical development, but her entire approach to life. She learned that speaking up for what you believe in, even when it's difficult or socially awkward, can lead to beautiful and unexpected outcomes. She also learned that true greatness lies not in never making mistakes, but in how gracefully you handle correction when mistakes are pointed out. As Sophie grew older, she continued to develop her musical abilities, eventually becoming a music teacher herself. She often told the story of her encounter with Elvis to her students, always emphasizing the lessons about musical accuracy, courage, and graciousness that she had learned that night. The story became a powerful tool for teaching young musicians that music belongs to everyone who loves it, and that helping each other improve is one of the most beautiful aspects of musical community. The Ryman Auditorium eventually installed a small plaque commemorating the evening when a young music lover's courage to speak truth created one of the most beautiful moments in our venue's history. The plaque serves as a reminder that music is a collaborative art form that benefits when people care enough about accuracy and beauty to speak up, even when it might be uncomfortable. Years later, whenever Sophie faced situations that required courage or honesty, she would remember that night at the Ryman and the tears of joy she had seen in Elvis's eyes. She learned that truth spoken with love and respect could create magic, and that the most meaningful moments in life often come when we're brave enough to care deeply about something and generous enough to share that caring with others. The photograph Elvis gave her remained prominently displayed in Sophie's home throughout her life, but more than that, it served as a daily reminder of the moment when her love of musical accuracy had been met with kindness, gratitude, and tears of happiness. It reminded her that music was indeed a language of love, and that speaking that language honestly and courageously could create moments of connection and beauty that would last forever.